This is the Roots and All podcast, and I'm your host, Sarah Wilson. Join me as I talk about all aspects of gardening with some of the top horticulturists from around the world. This week, I'm joined by Charlie Harpur, head gardener at the pioneering Rewilding project at Knepp, to explore what it really means to rewild a garden. We talk about how the garden has been designed and managed with biodiversity at its heart, and why constant observation and systems thinking is so important in a garden setting.
I trained as an architect originally and did that for a bit, worked in a few interesting places, but I did realise that I didn't want to be an architect anymore. And I realised this when I was living in Sweden, studying for my master's in architecture. And so I wrote to Tom Stewart-Smith, actually, a garden designer whose work I admired at the time and still do, as a matter of fact. And I asked if he had any jobs going, and he said, no, sorry, we are too full. And then I thought, well, okay, I'll carry on doing this for a while. And then 2 weeks later, I got an email out of the blue saying you could come for an internship. And so I went for a 3-month internship, and then I stayed there for another 3 years. And that was what got me into plants. And I, it's kind of in my family a bit. I come from a farming background, and my grandfather was a garden photographer. And uncle as well, so we had this garden photography business. So it was the sort of world that I was immersed in. But working with all these projects for Tom and having to procure plants and design with plants, I realised actually I really didn't know what I was doing in terms of understanding the plants that I was using. And you can't really learn a lot from a book. And I'd been a volunteer gardener at places like Fulham Palace, and I was a student at Great Dixter, and I worked in Tom's garden and all the rest. But I went away, I left Tom's and went to the Chelsea Physic Garden, and that was where I really had my first taste of botanic gardens and did my RHS level 2 there with great help from all of the team there and the volunteers. And then I went to Kew for the diploma and studied there for 3 years. And that was when I turned my attention more to the ecology side and did a big study there on the natural areas at Kew and the habitat management, and did a management plan and all the rest. And so a Knepp was on my radar then, and I went back to Tom's and worked on the plant library at the Surge Hill project. If you haven't been, please do. It's fantastic, a resource. And so I helped set that up and worked on a few projects. And then the Knepp project was in the office, and I decided to move down to Knepp to be head gardener full time. And I've been here for nearly 5 years. So that's a bit of a brief journey.
Yeah. How did Tom feel about you following the work down to Knepp?
He took it very well. I do feel bad. Tom has always been an incredible mentor to me, and he's always been a real supporter. I've had problems with my health over the years, and he's always supported me through that. And I still speak to him, and he gives me very sage advice when I ask for it. So, yeah, he took it very well. I do feel a bit bad, and I really miss the team. They've got such a great team working there, and I really miss them.
So when you went down to Knepp, then you were there right from the beginnings?
Yes, pretty much. So my colleague Honor at Tom's was the project lead there. And so the garden was starting to be ripped apart by the time I first went down on site to help plant the kitchen garden. So I've seen it through from Rewilded, and I'll get onto that mess, to what it is today.
And were you involved in the design aspect of it as well as the boots on the ground horticulture?
Not really, actually. The project was already in the office when I was at Kew. So I came back to Tom's, and Honor had already taken it so far, and the design had been in the making for a couple of years. So I really helped on the planting side. But the whole idea was put together by an advisory board with people like James Hitchmore and Charlie and Izzy here at Knepp. So the idea had all been really discussed, and it was actually listening into that made me put a few things together in my mind about the possibilities it could have.
And what was the brief for the design?
So bearing in mind that Knepp is a 25-year-old-ish rewilding project, very pioneering. They took a lot of risks. They gambled a lot with it, giving up farming and returning the land back to nature. The garden was a massive lawn. And so it wasn't really doing what Knepp was trying to do elsewhere. The garden was kind of overlooked. And I suppose everyone always thinks, well, I haven't got 3,500 acres, so what difference am I going to make? I can't put a whole lot of grazing animals into my garden. But what Charlie and Izzy wanted to do was ask the question, can you rewild a garden? And they wanted to know what thinking like that would do for the opportunities for wildlife in a changing climate. So that was the kind of brief, was can you rewild a garden? And I suppose the next bit was how can you maximise biodiversity in a garden whilst thinking a certain way?
When you say think in a certain way, I presume you mean making it still look like a garden.
Yeah, I mean, thinking a bit differently is probably how I would better frame it there. So the gardeners are the proxy keystone species within the garden. So we're not the grazing animal, we're not the devastating winds or flooding or uprooted trees or all of these other various disturbance elements that you'd see in a natural landscape. We are the proxy for all of those things. So within the walls of the garden, within the garden fence, we are the disturbance agents. We keep the whole system dynamic. So we've realized that we don't need to exactly think like a beaver. I think that's an interesting thing to say because it sort of summarizes a lot of how we think, but we don't just pretend to be animals when we're gardening. We're inspired by those different animals, different grazing styles and mouth parts and techniques, and we just try and mix it up as much as we can with our gardening interventions. So it means that we don't need to just focus on grazing plants out that we want to eat. We can make other decisions based on the role that certain plants play within an ecosystem. And so, on the point that you made there, we do, as the proxy keystone species, we do have an aesthetic. There is a slight aesthetic aspect to our management as well, because it is a garden and it needs to have a balance of providing for wildlife and also being a place that people use and enjoy. So that is definitely a guiding factor.
So when a plant is put into the garden, is it put there predominantly for biodiversity reasons? And if so, kind of how much do you drill down into that, or did the designers drill down into that? Did they think, okay, well, we don't have this in the wider landscape? Because obviously you are in the context of a wider landscape that should be hopefully packed full of biodiversity. So the garden can either mirror that or it can offer something over and above what the space outside the walls offers. So what's the kind of driver apart from the aesthetics? Are you saying, okay, well, in the wider landscape, we may not have this provision for this particular species, therefore we're going to include it in the garden? Or is it more of a kind of trial and error thing?
No, it is that. It's the first thing that you said there about looking to see what is around us and looking at what's missing, and then using that as inspiration for what to put within the garden. And there are definitely crossovers there. But that's the important part of rewilding that not everyone remembers, is connectivity is key. So in the wall garden here, we see it as a mosaic of different habitats, or we use the term kaleidoscope quite a lot because it has that movement factor. So it's a moving mosaic, different habitats. But I suppose the smaller the space that you have, you just think a little bit differently. So if I was looking back at my balcony in North London before I moved down to Knepp, I would now just see that as a mosaic piece within a wider mosaic, inspired by what is around me, to think about what I can put in my space to add to that corridor. So it's the same thing within the wall garden here. So we, having Tom and James Hitchmore as well, who really know their plants. James knows a lot from travelling and seeing plants in the native habitats in slightly more extreme climates, which we are sort of preparing for within this garden, and seeing the value that they might have for wildlife. So let's break it down here a little bit. We've got a lot of plants here for pollinating insects. So there's a lot of plants from native plant families within this garden, where you've got a flower structure that the insects will be able to recognise and they'll be able to get what they need from it. But the crucial thing is that we need native plants within that mix too, because our native insects have evolved alongside them, and pollinators get a lot of airtime, but actually it's the insect herbivores, it's the insects that have evolved alongside certain species to eat them, lay their eggs on them, use them as a larval food plant, reproduce on them, etc., etc. So that is a valuable part of the layer. And you can go so far with the design, but then we take it to the next steps through our management as gardeners as well. So most of the plants within the garden, they are ecologically accessible, as we say. They are not sort of sterile hybrids. They can be pollinated and set seed and spread. So they're offering those kind of opportunities throughout the year. And the reason that a lot of plants are not strictly from the UK is to try and pack in the opportunity in a changing climate, not only catering for migrating wildlife, because we are seeing various migrating insects that are starting to arrive here, but also, and this is another hot year, we've got another heat wave next year. The first year of this project we had about 4 months of no rain, and that was the 40-degree year. And so that was just when plants had gone into the ground. And so, having plants from further south in Europe, which have a familiar flower structure, can still pack in that opportunity, as well as looking good for us as well, the garden visitor. So that was the approach. It's that planting native species and non-native species together and seeing the merits in both to really pack out the opportunity. And the plants that just turn up, they are a fundamental part of this layer. This is a rewilding project in here. I've already said we can make decisions as the keystone species as to what stays and what goes. And so we've got a tool here that we use where we look at all the plants just turn up. Most of them really valuable native species, and we give them a score. We look at the number of insects that eat them, what services that they can provide to us, sort of ecosystem services like deep tap roots breaking through really compacted clay, which we have so much of in this garden and here at Knepp in general. Also, their invasiveness, because, we need to know how much they spread, how keen they are to spread. And then once they've spread everywhere, how difficult they are to remove. And then, as I've already covered, the last criteria for a scoring is the sensory score. Do they look or feel or smell nice? Can they be curated as garden plants? And so we get this score at the end, which really translates in a traffic light system for us as gardeners, where we're moving through the garden. We can make decisions based on what we are now learning about these plants, seeing the merit in them, seeing these, what a lot of people would refer to as weeds, in a different light, because they are just such a valuable layer, and we just garden them.
Yeah, so I'm guessing you have biodiversity audits in the garden.
We do, yeah.
Yeah.
Not as in-depth as places like Great Dixter with their absolutely enormous audit that they've done, but we still monitor it, yeah.
Yeah, well, I just wondered whether you had any information about kind of the profile of what you find within the walled garden as opposed to outside it.
That is actually a very interesting point. So where we are at Knepp is by the main house. It adjoins the house. And so this is surveyed in isolation, which actually kind of contradicts all of the connectivity points I was making earlier. But then the other audits at Knepp on the wider estate are down in what we call the southern block, which, there are some around here, but the most kind of clear picture that we would get would probably be in the main rewilding project areas. So we don't have that immediate comparison between what's in the garden and what's outside. Certainly, anecdotally, we work with an amazing entomologist, a pan-species recorder called Graham Lyons, who comes in here every 3 years and visits once a month for 6 months through the season, and records as much as he can find within, I think it's about a 2-hour window. So we know the stuff that is turning up, and there are a lot of wildlife in here, various insects, and I don't want to give game away because Graham is writing a report from our follow-up this year of various insect species that haven't been seen in the rest of Knepp yet. So yeah, it's all sort of anecdotal at the moment, but our numbers are going up, and I hope that they continue to do so.
Yeah, it'd be interesting as well to benchmark that against if there is such a thing as kind of an average UK garden or an average garden in the area too, because technically you should have a huge pool from which to draw on when it comes to biodiversity, given the surroundings of the garden. And then if you're also providing for them, you'd like to think that you were just this kind of botanical magnet that would attract everything that would be useful. So I don't know if you've ever done that or if you've got plans to do that as well.
We'll look into that, but I do know that, Knepp as a baseline had a pretty low baseline to begin with. Here on the low weald, where we've got 300 more metres of sticky weald and clay underneath our feet, We haven't got as higher numbers as a lot of other projects that I've seen. Places like Hilldrop in Essex, for example, and other rewilding sites like Wild Ken Hill in Norfolk. The conditions that they are working on are just so different. So they favour different types of insects and other wildlife. So the baseline is sort of dependent upon your surroundings. And Knepp, I know, is seeing a real resurgence, but it's working in actually quite a difficult area. Certainly vegetation-wise, it's pretty undiverse, or it has been. We get really rich, sticky soils that are waterlogged and baked to clay in the summer. And so it favours the thugs. So it favours the coarse grasses, the sort of brambles. And whilst actually, if you drive 10 miles down the road onto the South Downs, that's where I would go to look at diversity, just because of the chalk downlands there having that advantage for offering those opportunities. So it all depends upon the place that you're at.
Yeah, understandable. So you were talking about sort of your design background, and I'm guessing that because you touched on kind of how you manage the garden, I'm guessing having that design input is useful because it's almost as if there are no rules, there's no templates for that style of gardening where you've got very site-specific planting and a way of managing it that works with lots of different factors in mind. There's a lot of moving parts. Do you think that's a good strength to have as somebody who's overseeing a garden like that?
I think it is. I think a bit of design knowledge helps a lot to make decisions, as well as things like managing projects. I think that helps a lot. I don't think you need to have that training because I think, as a lot of us gardeners will say, that a lot of it is experience and intuition. But I think it certainly helped me. We have quite a few projects here on the estate, and I've got some planned where that background is really going to help. But I think for me, it's helped create some structure in the management of this garden. It all looks quite blurry at times, but there is some structure behind the scenes which helps.
And I'm guessing you're constantly learning, as you say, kind of as you go, because it is a bit of an unknown quantity. It's a fairly new garden. It's a fairly new way of gardening, really, for all of us to garden in tune with what naturally occurs and then kind of what we've put into a garden. Has there been anything that's kind of really surprised you in terms of, you came in with an idea that was how gardening was done, in inverted commas, and you've adapted it and thought, actually, that isn't the best way for us?
I don't want to get into the realm of saying this is not the right way to do it and this is the right way. Because as you say, we're learning all the time. And what we say to everyone that comes to see us for a tour here, we give them a few disclaimers. And one of them is, this is an experiment. And we're not by any means saying that it's the silver bullet. Here, we're working with quite a strong narrative where we're inspired by the ecology of rewilding and natural processes to try and think a bit differently about how we garden. So this is a sort of garden of extremes, and we're not expecting everyone to sort of go, right, that's how I'm doing it now. I'm taking everything to extremes. As long as it inspires a bit of a mindset shift, just to realise that other ways are possible, then that's what we're really interested in.
I bump up against this a lot, which is people who are looking for the right way to do things or the textbook on such and such. And there just isn't such a thing. There's so many different ways of doing it, and especially if you are trying to encourage other people to garden in a way that's experimental or sympathetic, it's sometimes quite difficult to sell the idea because you can't just say, well, this is how it's done and this is the best way to do it for that outcome, because it's so site specific and it's untried and untested, really. I mean, how do you encourage people to go and garden with all those values in mind?
That's a very good question. And there's a lot of different layers to answering, I suppose. Firstly, one example in mind is what I've mentioned already, the grazing index, we call it, which is that tool where we assess the plants that we've got here and whether they should stay or whether they should go. This is what we refer to as the volunteer plants rather than the weeds. And people say, oh, can we have a copy of the grazing index? I'd love to try it at home. And I think with a lot of this, as I've already said, it shouldn't be a direct blueprint. So with that tool, there is some science in it. There's using databases from the Biological Record Centre, etc. But a lot of it is subjective. It's based on our experience of gardens and gardening. So my opinion of a certain plant might differ, say, to my colleague Moy, who's got different experiences. She's been gardening for longer than I have, I think. So there is some subjectiveness, and it varies from site to site. So what is widespread here will be different from over there. And one plant might be, quote unquote, a problem in one garden, and it might not be here. So it's sort of what I would encourage with that way of thinking is to make your own grazing index and build it up with your own experience and experience of the garden that you are tending to. And then I suppose it's people come here, and I was talking to someone the other day about being typecast, because a lot of people look at this garden and they think, it's the concrete garden. I see. And we do have areas of concrete on this garden, and that is all site one. It's crushed up farm building that would otherwise have gone to landfill. And I think people just assume that we just blanketed the garden with a whole load of concrete, but it's in quite carefully designed areas and only makes up a small percentage of the overall garden. And it's one of those things, and it was Benny Hawksby actually put up a post about building materials for ground nesting insects. So this is where I want to be careful, and we are careful with people that come visit us, is that we're not saying go and get a whole load of concrete and chuck it on your garden. It's kind of like, if you have the resources available and it makes sense within your context, then you can use that as a tool to widen the spectrum of conditions that you've got. But it shouldn't be seen in isolation. So I suppose, in answer to your question, with those two things in mind, it's about mindset. And I've already said you don't have to go to the extremes that we do in this garden, because we have quite a strong narrative to work with here. And so we're sort of bound, in a sense, in this experiment. But I suppose it's just subtly changing the way that you think, being inspired by diversity and complexity within your garden, seeing that garden as that kaleidoscope, using the context, the plants, the materials that you have available on your site to try and pack in as much opportunity. And it's hard to sort of say, right, use this exact design in any other space.
Thanks to Charlie for sharing his knowledge. If you enjoyed today's episode, you might also like episode 376, From Rewilding to Renaturing, and episode 239, Growing Biodiversity. You'll find links to both in the show notes, and as always, thank you for listening. Next up is Benny with his insect of the week.
The Pantaloon bee. Scientific name, Dasypoda hirtipes. So my insect of the week this week is a fantastic bee. And it kind of needs no introduction, I would have thought. But let's go over the etymology first. Dasypoda comes from Greek, meaning shaggy-footed. And hirtipes, the second word of the scientific name, comes from Latin, and it means hairy-footed. So I think from those two pieces of etymology, I think we can start to understand why. And if you've seen this bee, especially the female, she's got these huge pollen-carrying hairs called scopa, or pollen brushes, on the back legs, and they look like big pantaloons. So a really good bee to get people excited about. The males, quite unusually, also have very long hairs on the back legs in particular. And it's not usually that common in male bees because they don't collect pollen. So just a recap on some of the basics of bees. Only females collect pollen. Males wouldn't collect pollen unless it was accidental just on their bodies. So they wouldn't pack pollen or take it back to brood cells for their young to be develop on. And just another reminder that the pollen is the protein for the young to develop on. So it's really, really crucial. The right type of pollen is available locally. Nectar is just a liquid that keeps insects on the wing. So the Pantaloon bee, I've just been seeing this bee in the last week, and I just absolutely adore it. Found some new sites for it as well, which is very exciting. Typically at the minute, this kind of southern half of the UK and Ireland, with climate changing, we may well see the species moving northwards. It's often associated with sandy ground. But the habitats you may find it in include coastal dunes, heathland, acid grassland, soft rock cliff, salt marsh edge, and sandy brownfield. So quite a wide range of habitat, even gardens if they're big enough and they've got enough kind of sunny bare ground. I've seen them nesting in paths which is not pure sand, but kind of very well compacted sandy loam, I would probably describe it as. So it's that full sun, compacted and bare ground that's really key, but it often is a very sandy mix. The flowers this bee typically visits are yellow composites. So some of my favourite things like cat's ear, some of the hawk beards and hawk bits, ox tongues, and then other plants like knapweeds and ragworts and chicory is another favourite, especially for the males. Some plants are kind of suitable more for nectar rather than pollen collection. The pollen collection seems to be really heavily weighted towards those yellow composites. So once again, a reminder, those plants are so important for your garden. Just to leave some of them in your lawn flowering or on the edge of your border. Really, really crucial food. And some of those plants, chicories included, and perennial south thistle, they kind of close up in the afternoon, so they kind of morning available. So often this bee is foraging in the morning, which is quite interesting. Roughly mid-June to late August is the window, and there's only one generation. So one generation, and then the females will obviously lay eggs for the following year, and then those young bees won't come out until the next June. So just an annual cycle for the species. So I really hope you've seen a Pantaloon bee. If not, I'm going to share a small video on Instagram. And please do keep an eye out. It's a magnificent creature. I'd love to get some more records around the place, and hopefully there are more sites where it's present, just not known yet. As always, please do record on the iRecord and iNaturalist apps.
You can download or listen to the podcast direct from the website rootsandall.co.uk. Please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support the podcast. Because if you enjoy the show, please help it continue. I also have a GoFundMe where you can make a one-off donation. Even a one-off donation of £1 helps, and I'll be really grateful for your support. So please go to Patreon or GoFundMe and search for Roots and All Podcast.